Hey everyone, welcome to Amateur Hour with me, Ben, the Amateur Exegete. Today is Saturday, November 20th, and on today's episode, I'll be showing you an interview I conducted with V La Bianca on the relationship of journalism to skepticism about the Bible, as well as the ways in which the Bible has been weaponized against members of the LGBTQIA community. Before we get to that, let me briefly discuss what's been going on in my world. First, I had the privilege of interviewing Bernard Lamberel back in October for episode 6 of Amateur Hour. We talked about his recently published comic book, To Be Done with Sodom, a work that is based on his controversial monograph, The Covenant, on the origin of the Abrahamic faith by means of deification. Lamberel is both amicable and astute, and I greatly enjoyed our conversation. Second, episode 10 of Bible Study for Amateurs aired this past Thursday, and it covered the 3 hours of darkness that purportedly took place when Jesus died. If you haven't had a chance to listen to this new episode, or any of the previous 9, the link will be available in the episode description. Third, more posts in the Invasion of the Bible Snatchers series have been published, and there are only 3 more that will come out between now and the end of the year. These will close out my examination of Ray Comfort's Scientific Facts in the Bible. Finally, last week I released a video examining Danny Akin's reasons for believing the Bible to be inerrant. Check it out if you haven't already. Back in late October, I had the privilege of talking with V LaBianca on a couple of different topics. How journalism helps us evaluate the claims made by the Bible, and how the Bible has been used as a weapon against those in the LGBTQIA community. In the conversation that you're about to watch, they talk about their own experiences and offer insights that I think are beneficial to skeptics. So, without further ado, my interview of V La Bianca.
There's always bias, but a lot of the time it's very difficult to pick up on that bias if you don't understand the surrounding context. So understanding the purpose of the piece, understanding how it fell into the narrative of the time, understanding who the intended audience was, because it certainly wasn't 21st century Americans, right?
That's right, yeah.
So understanding all of these things is, I think, step number 1 to really honestly getting the most out of reading the Bible, because there's so much history there and there's so much poetry and just intrigue. Especially when you understand, for example, the story of Eve and the serpent in Genesis has been posited by archaeologists who understand what was happening at the time to be very specifically anti-goddess propaganda that was being inserted into the narrative.
Well, viewers, today I have the unique privilege to interview V LaBianca. And so just take a moment and introduce yourself. Tell us just who you are and some of the things that you're involved in, especially with social media and YouTube.
Absolutely. It's wonderful to be here with you. I'm super excited to have a chance to talk with you. I know we were just talking a minute ago. We've been following each other on Twitter since before I got into the YouTube game. So it's nice to finally put a face to the name.
Oh, pleasure's all mine.
My name is V La Bianca. I am one of the hosts of the independent call-in show, Skeptic Generation, which airs every Sunday at 11:30 a.m. Central. We talk with callers about all different kinds of things, what they believe and why, kind of get into the nitty-gritty and have some really good, honest conversations with folks. I also have a Twitter account that is my personal baby, my little magnum opus over there. Finally hit 10K there, which is exciting.
Wow.
I was going for that for so long, just like, please just give this to me. There's never been a viral tweet. It's just been like slow, steady increments every single time. Yeah, I just get on there and shoot the shit with people, try and throw in some hot takes. But yeah, it's essentially me sharing my perspective as somebody who used to be a fundamentalist Christian and is now a non-binary, bisexual, atheist, witch type person. So pretty big switcheroo.
Yeah, sounds like it. So two things. How long has the Skeptic Generation been going on? It's a fairly new show.
It is new.
A year old is what is it?
Oh, it's only 6 months. It'll be 6 months in November. So when this airs.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
It is.
And before that, were you doing a show with Matt Dillahunty?
I was doing a couple of different shows with the atheist community of Austin. I was one of the regular co-hosts on Talk Heathen, and then I also had a regular spot on their Thursday show, Secular Sexuality.
That's right. Yeah. Okay. I couldn't remember which ones those were.
Oh, all of them. I've been everywhere at this point.
And so your Twitter handle. Oh man. So explain the origins of your Twitter handle, because it is amazing. I love it.
So my Twitter handle is @authorconfusion, and it came about during my angry atheist phase back in 2017. I decided to create an alt account that was different from my actual account, faceless, nameless. Author of Confusion essentially was my moniker there. And I obviously did that because God is not the author of confusion. So someone needs to take that title, and I just decided it should be me. So it's a little bit of a subtle jab, but yeah, it turned into my regular account. My old one is kind of defunct at this point, and it's just stuck around.
Yeah, I love it because I think early on, if I remember correctly, some of the tweet conversations you were having with Christians, I mean, it was the handle that they just could not, pun intended, handle. You know what I mean? Like they just could not get over. Oh, God is not you're not from God. Oh, it was.
No, and that was the fun part. It's like, no, exactly. Like you're spot on. Like I'm not.
You've hit the nail on the head.
You're exactly right.
When I was laying down. Oh man. So, okay. So you've kind of already hinted at it. Your religious views currently. So you're not a Christian.
No.
Obviously. Do you fall more in the atheist camp, the agnostic camp? Where do you place yourself on that spectrum of unbelief?
Yeah, good question. I consider myself an agnostic atheist, which already has some of your viewers panties in a twist, I'm sure.
Oh yeah.
So there's always going to be the battle of definitions, and we actually had a call this last week with a caller who wanted to know whether or not we were, strong or weak atheists, or hard versus soft atheists, and those all seem kind of like weird and vaguely sexual. But essentially, my take is that I am an agnostic in the sense that I don't think it is possible to know if a definitionally unfalsifiable deity exists, because it is by definition unfalsifiable.
Oh, yeah.
For all of the versions that I have been presented with attempts at evidence and attempts at proof, I am a strong atheist in that I do not believe that those particular gods exist. But I wouldn't go so far as to say that something that is beyond our comprehension could not exist, because then that would be taking on a burden of proof that I couldn't back up. Yeah,
no, that's a safe position, a philosophically safe position to take. Yeah. So yeah. So what kind of we'll get into this more in just a minute, but what has brought you to that view of this agnostic atheism? What is some of the conversations you've had, or the evidence you've looked at, the arguments you've taken into account? What has led you to the place you are now?
Oh, damn. How long do we got?
Yeah.
It's been a pretty long journey. I would say I'm going on year 4 or 5 of deconstructing everything.
The buzzword deconstructing
The
there.
buzzword, there you go. It's, take a drink if you're doing the game. So essentially I grew up very conservative, very Christian, very fundamentalist. I was the oldest of 6 children, homeschooled, home churched, uh, told I wouldn't go to college because I didn't have a dick, and essentially had to go to college without real consent from my father, which was cool. But I went to a private Christian school about 40 minutes up the road from where I lived. And it was there that I started engaging with a lot of these questions. I was very sheltered, and so I only had a very narrow view of everything. And being in a place where I felt safe because I was around other Christians, even though they were of different denominations, gave me an opportunity to slowly start to open up. And the school itself required a whole lot of additional theologically bent classes. So I was required to take theology classes, biblical history classes, attend chapel twice a week. I took Koine Greek for 2 semesters, translated Paul into and out of English.
Nice.
So I had a pretty robust experience diving into these questions, at least initially. And I slowly started realizing, that my personal beliefs were shifting towards a more progressive approach, something alongside universalism, alongside the vulnerable God, a God that is strong in his weakness and our ability to injure that God. Like it became like very kind of like amorphous. And, at that point, a lot of people would probably have not considered me a Christian at all anymore.
Yeah.
But in my head, I was still calling myself one. And then in 2014, I was in London studying abroad for my journalism degree. And I went to a church and had what I call an anti-religious experience, in that I felt like I woke up in the middle of a church service. And that feeling where you wake up and you're in a different bed because you're like visiting family or something, and you're like, where am I? What's going on? And I'm about to fall off the bed. Like this moment of like panic.
Yeah.
I had that feeling in the middle of nowhere, just as people were standing around me worshiping. And I look around and I go, why am I here? What am I doing? What are we doing? And that kind of set me off on this spiral. I ended up practically going comatose, just like on the floor in a fetal position, like God is gone. What is happening? And it was intense. It was the most intense experience I think I've ever had. And after that, I got up and I continued to call myself a Christian, but there was a component that was missing, which was that like that relationship piece, because in my head, I guess God broke up with me in that moment. And then I was like, nah, we're still on good terms. We're just taking a break. We're totally still together for about another year or 2. And so it allowed me to start asking harder questions that had inefficient and not satisfactory answers.
Yeah.
So after undergrad, I went into grad school, stopped calling myself a Christian, started practicing Wicca and witchcraft, called myself a naturalistic pantheist for a while, and then started finding atheist content creators on YouTube, reading the books that we all know and love. God is Not Great, The God Delusion, all of the required reading, and started realizing that it most accurately portrayed my position and answered questions best that I had been asking for years at that point.
That's interesting. Yeah, I can kind of see how it'd be emotionally jarring to have that relationship be severed,
Yeah, to this day, I don't know what happened. Like, I'm assuming I had some kind of like mini seizure or something, and it was purely chemical. And for some reason I had linked it to my concept of God and religion. But whatever it was, it kind of cut the umbilical cord.
Yeah, for the better, I hope.
Absolutely.
So in your interview with Seth Andrews, the Thinking Atheist, you were referred to as, and I just love this because there's so many aspects to it, but you were called the Anti-Strobel.
Yes.
I mean, I remember when I was watching it, and I actually laughed out loud. I really did, because I just thought I was in the man cave. I think I was cleaning something. I think I was sweeping or something, and I just thought, wow, that's pretty good. So why the Anti-Strobel? What's up with that?
So for those of us who are unlucky enough to know who Lee Strobel is, he is a Christian apologist and author. The Case for Christ is the book he's most known for. And he claims that his journalism, because he was a reporter, led him to Christianity, because he used to not believe, although looking at his testimony, I think that's shaky.
Yeah.
He used to not believe, allegedly. And through researching the gospel as though it were a case that he was on as a journalist, he came to the conclusion that God was real. And you can't do that with journalistic methods. That's not how that works. But mostly the reason that I like that title is because my deconversion started going to school for journalism, learning the journalistic integrity, the tenets of good research, and things like primary sources. And
so let's talk about that. So when you read a news article, or you read an apologist, you look at some piece of information, what are some of the things that start running through your head as you look at it?
Good question. So the biggest thing that was kind of drilled into me that I've taken away from my journalism studies is that there is always bias. It is impossible to eliminate bias. You can try your best, but regardless of the words you used those words for a reason. And then whoever reviewed your work kept those in or left them out, took them out and replaced them for a reason. So there is always a deeper reason for the words that we choose. So I am very, very particular about the words that I use. And when I read something, whether that's from an apologist or a fellow atheist or a news article about whatever is happening in the world, that is the very first thing that I put on as that first filter. What words are being used? What were the other options for these words? And why weren't those chosen?
Okay. Yeah, that's good.
The next thing is looking for primary sources. And honestly, I know that this is kind of, I would hope that this is kind of a known thing to do when you read through an article and you skim and you go, okay, well, it says, a source says. Well, I mean, I understand that sometimes that can be useful, especially if you're trying to get sensitive information out of someone who could lose their job or be sued if they, tell you things.
Exactly.
But for the most part, you should be telling people where your information is coming from if you can. And if it doesn't look like you're trying to do that, then why is that, right? There's a little bit of a red flag there. Another issue is, and this came into play a lot during the 2016 elections, and I was pounding down the door on Facebook, just like, guys, you don't understand. We're getting these articles, and I'm following the links that they're putting into these articles, and it's sending me to non-existent pages, and they all lead back to this one non-existent page. This is not accurate. This is not journalism. This is a troll farm. And that's become the norm now, unfortunately, it feels like.
Oh, yeah.
But always following those sources to their very end and then reading it, right? Because another thing that a lot of people like to do, especially Christians who are proponents of certain belief systems like young earth creationism, is they'll read a news article that covers a scientific paper, for example, and not the scientific paper itself. And so the science reporter is not a scientist. right? And their job is to sell things. So they're going to, maximize how important it is. They're going to say it's world shaking. They're going to say it turns everything we know on its head. And that's what they're going to pull from. If you go into the article, more often than not, it's actually not that exciting, but it also doesn't say what everyone else thinks it says. So just following it down to that primary source is always, always important.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I had a friend on Facebook who unironically shared during the election, shared a post that was, and I kid you not, from the Babylon Bee of all places. God. Yeah. I mean, he really believed that it was telling the truth. And I was listening to a podcast this past week from the Atlantic where they talked about the Babylon Bee. They interviewed the guy who runs it. And they talked about, there's people that really share this stuff thinking it's true. How does that make you feel? And he just kind of, not my problem, whatever. But I think you're right. I think people don't tend to read their sources, or they don't read them with an eye, with a skeptical eye, which is, I think, very important to have. So let's take this and take your journalism training and let's apply it to the Bible. So when you read, and I know you have, when you read the biblical texts, what are some of the things that you do as you read them?
Yeah.
With this journalism training.
Right. One thing that I think gets lost a lot, and this is more for the average Christian, perhaps, than the apologist, because most apologists understand that there are different genres within the Bible, right? And that different people have written it at different points in time, and that we have kind of decided as an aggregate that these are what we're going to include. And it's very helpful to understand that, especially if you're just a lay person who is reading the Bible on your own, or perhaps being guided by a pastor who perhaps hasn't been to seminary or is a history teacher who just got her bachelor's degree. It's important to make sure that you understand the intent of the writer and the time period that they were writing in. Right? Because again, there's always bias, but a lot of the time it's very difficult to pick up on that bias if you don't understand the surrounding context. So understanding the purpose of the piece, understanding how it fell into the narrative of the time, understanding who the intended audience was, because it certainly wasn't 21st century Americans, right?
That's right. Yeah.
So understanding all of these things is, I think, step number one to really honestly getting the most out of reading the Bible, because there's so much history there and there's so much poetry and just intrigue, especially when you understand, for example, the story of Eve and the serpent in Genesis has been posited by archaeologists who understand what was happening at the time to be very specifically anti-goddess propaganda that was being inserted into the narrative of the Fertile Crescent at the time of its conquest. So there are things that are 10 times more interesting about the Bible once you understand kind of where that all was coming into play.
Definitely. One of the books I recently read was, it's an older book from, I think, the 80s, maybe the late 70s, Gerda Lerner, The Creation of Patriarchy. And she goes, excellent book. And she goes into the origins, of patriarchy, but she talks about the biblical world, the rise of religious cults, and how that played into the suppression of women. Yes. In the cult, and specifically, these mother goddesses that existed that were subsequently erased.
Absolutely. Have you? I guarantee you, she was pulling from Merlin Stone's book When God Was a Woman as well, because that was the book that changed how I viewed a whole lot of things.
But I need to go back and look at her sources, because I didn't. It's been a few months since I've read it, but I'm sure that's probably one of the sources she looked into. She has a sequel book that she wrote to that I have not read yet. I'd like to, but I think she passed away a few years ago.
Well, I'm going to have to put that on my list for sure, because that sounds fascinating.
It was a really good book. really, and it was a page turner. It was an excellent book. But it's I think the creation of patriarchy. So, but yeah, so tracing back primary sources, I'm thinking specifically like when you look at the gospel accounts, like the synoptic gospels.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone says, well, we have three different independent eyewitnesses, but that's not the reality. The reality is we have one source for many of these stories, and it's Mark. And
Mm-hmm.
Mark's our primary source. Helen Bond, she's a scholar of the historical Jesus, but she wrote a book recently on the Gospel of Mark, and she says at the end, because she believes John used Mark too, and she says, well, for better or for worse, our primary source for for many of these stories is Mark.
Yeah.
You trace it back, and I don't know about you, but that would make me a little uncomfortable to think that we have one guy who's given us all this. How do we corroborate?
Yeah, it's impossible to. And the downside of that is that the worldview of the people who would care about corroboration has been so corroded by this concept of accepting unfalsifiability that they don't care, right?
Mm-mm.
It's not about, oh, wait, you're saying we can't verify these things with third-party sources or cross-check them with other contemporary accounts? Well, I'm going to have to rethink. Like, of course, there are some people who do that and, more power to them. But for the most part, that's not even a value that is held. And so we come to this point where not only does it not convince people who would, begin to question the Bible otherwise, that concept of, I don't need to falsify things, I just believe them, is then carried out when you're reading actual journalism, right? When you're reading news stories, when you're reading, current events, like that mindset of, I don't care if I can cross-check this. It's telling me what I want to hear, so it's okay.
That's good.
Is pervasive.
Yeah, they've taken their hermeneutic for reading the Bible and applied it to everything.
Yeah.
That's a really good point. Wow, that's a really good point. Have you heard of Doug Wilson? He's a pastor out of Moscow, Idaho.
The name rings a bell.
Yeah, so a few years ago, he was at John Piper's Desiring God conference, and you surely know John Piper.
Yes, unfortunately.
And it was a celebration of John Calvin's life.
Mm-hmm.
And Doug Wilson gave a talk, and in the talk he said, people tried to place the Bible in this like a schoolroom to be tested and prodded and poked. And this is what he said, and it stuck out to me then. I believed it then, and now as an atheist, I'm like, oh, this is bad. But he said, but the Bible never volunteered itself to enroll in that class to begin with. Meaning, you can't judge the Bible. The Bible is its own standard of perfection.
I mean, I would argue that by saying it is the most important book in the world and divinely inspired, that kind of enrolls it in that speculation.
It invites it.
Yeah.
I mean, you would think.
Oh my goodness.
I don't know. Well, so we've kind of talked about how you approach the Bible, how and kind of, and we've talked about how it compares to how a lot of evangelicals, fundamentalists do. So let's talk about your interactions specifically with, for lack of a better word, fundagelicals.
I like that.
Yeah, with your journalism background, because I mean, between your Twitter handle and just who you are, you interact with some really, really like just bold, strident, often angry people. How do you approach this? What are your tactics for dealing with these kinds of people who, I mean, I'm not trying to denigrate them, but they have sincere questions. They really do. It's based on their worldview, but they often come across very hostile. So what do you do?
Yeah, there are a couple different things that I've learned over the years. I think at first, when I first started interacting with people as an atheist and as somebody who had done a lot of this thinking and this study myself, I would have just jumped right in and been like, well, you're wrong, and here's why. And just dove straight into that mess. And I don't do that as much anymore, just because it doesn't feel comfortable. because the less angry I get, the more empathetic I'm able to be and
Mm.
understand that I used to be in that position too. And what helped me was not people being angry at me. That only doubled down, my convictions. So I do take a different approach now. And usually, what I'll do, and I've done this with close family as well, especially around things that maybe aren't directly Bible related, but for example, before I even came out as trans non-binary myself, I sat down and had a conversation with a family member about trans stuff. And I wanted to see what their take was and what they thought. And they had clearly been absorbing some bad information. And they were using all of these reasons, well, science, and well, protecting kids, and well, like social order, and who will have the babies, as though that would change.
Red herrings here, red herrings there.
And I honestly, and here's the thing, they were absolutely red herrings because I ended up getting to the bottom of it, but I didn't call them out as red herrings. I addressed each one and I asked, if this thing were proven false, where would you go next? And because they trusted me, because I wasn't attacking, I was asking questions, eventually I was able to get to the point where they admitted that even if all of the science was against them and all of their fears about social order and, protecting children and protecting women were all put to rest, that they still would be against the concept because it conflicted with their faith and God said so. And so for me, I left it there. Not because I couldn't get into, well, point to a single verse that talks about, transitioning in the Bible, but because that's as far as I wanted to get. As soon as they heard themselves say that, and as soon as they told me that, it became very clear that this wasn't actually an intellectual debate. This wasn't actually something that was up for discussion. This was them digging their heels in. And they said that. And I admire the fact that they could just go out and say, you know what? No, this is what I believe, and this is what I'm sticking to. I don't think it's a useful way to approach the world, but it does take bravery to be able to say, okay, I admit that even if I were wrong, I would still cling to this, because then we can have the real conversation.
Yeah. Wow. That for you, that I don't know that I'd be able to do that. Just knowing who I am. But you're right. Less anger does tend to yield more empathy. Mm-hmm. So on your YouTube shows that you've been involved in, the current one as well, what have been some of the more telling, the more alarming interactions that you've had with some call-ins?
Yeah, there are always a couple where my instinct is to just kind of cut things off. And that's been met with mixed reviews. There are the people who very much like the fact that I will hang up on somebody. And for some reason, everyone assumes that I have learned that skill, as though like the concept of hanging up on somebody who's being obnoxious is like unheard of outside of like
you invented it.
I like, clearly. But usually the only times I will ever hang up on somebody are one of two times, apart from being an obvious troll, is if they have a deeply embedded misconception that is harmful, that is not the subject of the call. So, for example, we had a caller, I want to say late last year, and he was talking about a verse in the Bible and how it didn't actually condone rape. And we were arguing about whether or not this verse condoned rape. But the larger problem was that this person was defining it in such a way that proved to me that he was a problematic person who did not value consent, and probably would become like there were concerns around his ability to be a consensual sexual partner. And unless we were to like completely divert the conversation into, well, that's not what consent is, and I'm concerned for everybody who has ever slept with you, then, I wasn't going to continue a conversation cordially with somebody who was essentially a rape apologist. So I, terminated the call. The only other time that I'll hang up on somebody is if they are gish galloping with information that I am not qualified or ready to refute in the moment. So a more recent example, a couple of weeks ago, we had an anti-vax person call in from the UK and start kind of just word vomiting a bunch of claims. And I knew some were absolutely false, and I pointed those out. And it just kept going. And as somebody who isn't a doctor and not an epidemiologist and not somebody who has studied this extensively, I didn't have the qualifications or the ability to actively refute it sufficiently. So I felt bad giving it a platform in the first place. So I made the call to, terminate. But those are really the only two ways that you could get kicked off of my show.
I mean, you would make a terrible Christian apologist. That's just terrible. Not wanting to talk about things that are outside of your field. I mean, that is just unreal. Unreal. I'm just glad you're not doing that. You would make no money.
I picked the right life path, turns out.
You did. So let's move on to the Bible as a weapon. Because I know when I was a Christian, I used the Bible as a weapon. Yeah. So given your conservative upbringing, what were some of the ways that the Bible was weaponized, maybe against you, or the way you saw it weaponized by those around you?
Yeah, that's intense. My dad, who is no longer with us, was very emotionally abusive and manipulative to the point of causing enough damage that eventually the entire family left. And his fundamental tool in that was the Bible, not just to subdue the rest of the family, but also to justify things to himself. Because there was a part of him that was concerned about this and knew that he was causing harm. And I think that's true for most people who use the Bible as a weapon. I think it works in a twofold way, where it is the sword, but it is also the shield. And it works as a way to subdue others and to cause harm, but it also helps you feel better about causing that harm. So it's a messy cycle to get out of.
Yeah, you feel like, well, God said it. You're arguing. My line was usually, well, you're arguing with God. You're not arguing with me.
Yeah,
you're arguing with God, which is just the height of hubris. I mean, it's just, who am I to speak for God? I mean, I looking back on just the person that I was, there's a lot of mixed emotions there, because there's a sense of nostalgia that I have for those days.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I did harm. I know I did harm. And I can't do anything to change that. It's just, it sucks for lack of a better word.
Well, I mean, I think you could probably share in this small sucker, which is that I personally, and I'm sure you have as well at this point, I've deconverted more people than I've converted. So I'm balancing the scales of karma or what have you.
You're the anti-evangelist, the anti-Billy Sunday.
Honestly, they trained me well, and then I went and played for the other team. So
that's not fair. You're not supposed to do that.
I do many things I'm not supposed to do.
Evidently, I won't tell anybody. So you recently did a video responding to, and I really hesitate to talk about her, but everyone's favorite business professor, S.J. Thomason.
Yep.
And you and I have both had many interactions with her in the past. So what are some ways in which apologists like Thomason and others weaponize the Bible against skeptics like yourself? and me,
Yeah.
I guess.
I mean, it's it's interesting to talk about Thomason specifically, and that caliber of. Here's the thing. There are apologists like William Lane Craig, Alvin Plantinga, these people who weaponize philosophy against skeptics, and it's biblically inspired philosophy, but that's what they're using. That is their tool. Apologists who use the Bible as a tool against skeptics fail, and they don't hurt the skeptics. The reason I have issues with apologists who use the Bible as a weapon is because they're hurting other Christians who also see that Bible as something powerful.
Yeah.
When I think about SJ or anybody else of that kind of mindset and caliber coming at me with the Bible as a weapon, I kind of picture like when my little brother used to like attack me with a kitchen towel and just be like swatting me around the house. And it's like, okay, well, it's annoying, but you're not doing me any damage. The damage you are causing is not to the atheists. It's not to the skeptics. It's to the fellow Christians in your congregation. And historically, other Christians have been some of the most abused people by Christians. And that's kind of the reason that I have this discomfort around it. And then the reason I speak out about it, it's not because I feel attacked. It's because I see the harm that it's causing to people like the person I used to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's a good way to look at it, that it's that the intended target may be the skeptic, but the collateral damage is their own people.
Yeah.
There was an evangelist who used to come through my church growing up, and he used to say that Christians are some of the worst because they're the only ones that'll shoot their wounded. They just will. They'll put down their own wounded, and not have any kind of sympathy or empathy for them. And it's just tragic. It's just absolutely tragic. So, what are some of the ways you've seen the Bible weaponized against members of the LGBTQIA community? Because, and I'm sure there's specific Bible texts you can think of, but I know that when talking with members of that community growing up, when I was zealous for the Lord,
yeah,
I could just sock it to them, regardless of their feelings and their emotions. Because, as I said before, God said it. You're arguing with God. So, what are some of the ways it's been weaponized? It's just
I kind of love that moment just there. Hello and welcome to Arguing with God. I'd watch that. I would watch the hell out of that.
A good show.
So there are two ways I think that I would say that the Bible is used against the queer community. And on the one hand, we can think of things like policy that is inspired by a particular religion in our country, that is Christianity, that is used to reduce the safety, reduce the rights, reduce the comfortability of queer people because it makes Christians uncomfortable. So things like religious liberty laws in terms of you don't have to treat somebody who is gay if you are a doctor and they are dying if it feels icky for you. That is a very real way that the Bible is being used to harm people. And the other way is, again, queer Christians, because I have so many friends who are on that beautiful, the rainbow mafia, let's call it, and also struggling with their faith. And they don't want to give it up. And they want to find community. They want to find a church. And they do feel this connection with Jesus and with this religion that they grew up in. And they are constantly putting themselves on the chopping block and just allowing, not allowing, that's victim blaming, but the people who are struggling the most right now with the Bible are queer Christians. Yeah. And if anybody should care about Christians, it should be other Christians. And to me, that's the mind fuck, right? Because I'm queer, I'm an atheist. If you want to tell me the Bible thinks I'm an abomination, I'll be like, oh, okay, cool, well, fine. I don't really care very much.
Yeah.
Thanks, bye. But if you are using that book that still has so much power and so much meaning against somebody who it just is who they are, it becomes a lot more harmful. So the two ways are policy related that impact everybody, not just the queer community. We are one of the first steps to a much larger agenda. And because most people can get away with some form of transphobia or homophobia, that's their in. And the other side is Christians who are gay, who are trans, who are bisexual, who still live in that environment and are harmed by it.
Yeah. Getting low on time, but I want to ask this question. How have members of the skeptical community, I've seen it, especially whether it's for some reason evolutionary psychologists. I've seen some of those professionals and others. They seem to have a real hard time accepting the trans community.
Yeah.
So what are some of the attacks that you've seen, and what has been your reaction? What because it's got to be a different strategy than dealing with Christians. Or it seems that way to me. Mm-hmm. So how do you deal with people that kind of believe like you do? They don't believe in God. They don't believe he exists, but yet they aren't following the science. They aren't following the psychology. What do you do? And what have some of the attacks been?
Yeah, that honestly has been the biggest hurdle for me. That's been the hardest part of this whole thing. I came out as non-binary for the first time on my debut on the Atheist Experience. Mm-hmm. And the comments under that video are horrendous. They are horrendous. And I don't know if they're from Christians or from atheists, but they're up there. They stayed up. Nobody took them down. Nobody refuted them. They just stay there. We have a little bit more of a policy on skeptic generation. But the thing is, there are so many people right now who are flirting with transphobia light, kind of. Like nobody's saying, there are very few people in the atheist community who are thought leaders, who are people who are respected and have that platform, who are saying outright that trans people shouldn't be allowed to exist, right? But there are a lot of people who pride themselves on making other people mad by quoting, quote, the science, right? And that's their entire gig. And it gets boring after a while to just talk about how God doesn't exist. And so there's this instinct to move into something else, something that gets you attention, something that polarizes people so that half of your followers are shocked, which is gratifying, and the other half rushes to your defense and says you're amazing and how brave you are for speaking out. And that's gratifying too. And so I think that a lot of this is stemming from a place of wanting to remain relevant, of wanting to be able to enter the discourse without wanting to look weak or like a bleeding heart, or saying anything that, would actually require research, because who does research anymore? It's Twitter. So you tweet out something stupid, you tweet out something harmful, and then people react, and it's the reaction that gets the blame. And that by itself shields whoever is perpetrating this information. So I think it's multifaceted. I can't point to a single person and claim to know their objectives or their motivation. Yeah. But overall, the people that I'm seeing gravitate towards this are not the up and coming skeptics in our community, because we're getting exceedingly more diverse and more accepting and more progressive. And I'm excited about it.
Yeah, me too.
Everybody who is gravitating towards this new way of thinking, this old way of thinking, I suppose, are people who are grasping at relevance. I used to be the change maker 20 years ago. Everybody hung on my every word, and I'm not getting as many views as I used to. What's hot right now? What can I say? What is the science, quote unquote, saying?
Yeah, that's a good observation, but very discouraging.
I'm jaded at this point, man. I can't help it.
I try not to get involved in those conversations. Number one, because I just lack the relevant expertise. But I just think to myself, that generation, and I really hate to say it, but it just needs to go the way of the dinosaur and just let progress be progress. It's just,
or just, get off Twitter. Like, that's a good start. Like, you don't have to go like die in a hole, but maybe log off.
Well, that's another thing is you can have an opinion and you can also keep that opinion to yourself.
Shocker.
I mean, I just like you invented hanging up on people. I just invented that. That's mine. I will trademark it. So let's wrap up here. This has been a really great conversation. So I really appreciate you coming on. So what would be some words of advice that you would have to skeptics who are engaging with what seems to be your bread and butter, hostile interlocutors? What would you say to a skeptic? What's some advice you would give them?
You, despite the way that YouTube and Twitter select for skeptics who are argumentative, hello, you don't have to be in order to be a good skeptic. You don't have to feel like you need to argue with people or that you need to engage with somebody just because they're yelling or, oh, this was a really bad take. I need to be the one to take it down because that's what skeptics do. That's not accurate. If you want to, I would say do it honestly and assume that the other person is being honest as well until it's proven that they're not, and then get the fuck out of there. And if you don't want to, then don't. Like, nobody's gonna take your atheist card away from you if you don't tell that believer that, the Jesus myth was inspired by Buddhism or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, absolutely. Is there anything you want to plug? You've already talked about Skeptic Generation. You want to talk about that for a minute again? That's the show that you do and with your co-host. My
co-host and fiance, Eric
congratulations.
Murphy. Thank you. My engagement photo has been pinned on my Twitter for an obnoxious amount of time. So no one is surprised at this point. I just like saying it.
Nope.
If you are interested in having conversations with me about these kinds of things, if you've heard something on this interview that maybe piqued your interest or, raised your hackles, give me a call. I'm actually readily available to talk to you every single week because that's how I've decided to torture myself for eternity. Skeptic Generation goes live every Sunday at 11:30 a.m. Central. You can call in on your phone, on your computer, toll free. We have call screeners who would talk to you and get you ready to go. And then we'll just have a good conversation. We'll chill and, talk about life and the afterlife and how it doesn't exist. It'll be great.
All right. Well, who does not enjoy a good phone conversation? So, well, maybe this generation doesn't because it's all texting now. Do you have a text number we can?
We do have super chats, so like.
Oh yeah, that's true. That is true. That's kind of like texting. That's good. So, well, V, again, thank you for coming on. This was a lot of fun for me. Like I told you before, I was really nervous about the conversation, but as we got into it, it's just kind of. You have a way of you had a way of putting me at ease.
Good.
And I learned a lot, which is really why I do these conversations. I want to learn. So
that's the best reason to have a conversation.
Oh. All right. Well, thank you again.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye. Well, that does it for this episode of Amateur Hour. If you want to learn more about V, be sure to check out the links in the video description. There you'll also find links to some of the things that I talked about earlier in the episode. And if you want to support my work, just head over to amateurexegete.com and hit the support button. Thanks for watching.